This is a man. John Camfield is a man who is an absolute, total drunk. He doesn't care about anyone but John Camfield. He didn't care about those children he ran over. He didn't care about that pregnant woman whose vehicle he ran into.
I was never ever expected to be grabbed from the back and thrown from side to side to a point where I was yelling at the top of my lungs, help, help.
9 seconds from the time you start to encounter this individual without a probable cause, without a warrant, without knowing what crime, before you pull the trigger. 9 seconds.
Before he presents the weapon in a threatening manner, correct?
Yes, 9 seconds.
Yes.
When dirty cops use their position of power to manipulate and abuse other people for their own gain, it is often the most vulnerable and marginalized people in our society that they target. These are the people who might not be able to stand up for themselves or think that if they do, nobody will believe them. But karma or the legal system usually catches up to even the dirtiest of cops, who thought that they would never have to pay the price for what they did. The following stories tell the tale of 3 dirty cops who destroyed their career and landed huge criminal charges in the process.
Friends and family members of George Floyd, Jacob Blake, and Oscar Grant are in town for the trial.
We're not asking, we're demanding. We come in from all over the country. We're not going to stand still and let this continue to happen to us over and over again.
In the end, a judge, not a jury, will decide DeValkenier's fate.
On December 3rd of 2019, a horrific tragedy happened in Kansas City, Missouri, at the hands of a former detective named Eric DeValkenir. It resulted in the death of an unarmed black man named Cameron Lamb inside of Cameron's own home. But the events surrounding that shooting were considered to be pretty controversial by some people at the time, with some believing that Eric was only defending himself and his partner and had no choice but to fire his weapon, and ultimately, Cameron. Others believed that Eric was nothing more than a trigger-happy cop who had no reason to be at Cameron's house in the first place. So, who is right and who is wrong? Let's get down to the details, and you can let us know your own opinion about what happened at the end of the video. On the night that the incident occurred, Eric and his partner, Troy Schwalm, were called to the scene after someone had called 911 to report that a man was chasing his girlfriend in a pickup truck that was believed to have been stolen. But despite this claim, there was no actual proof that a crime had been committed. Troy and Eric went on to Cameron's property without permission to confront him. They had no warrant, and as the prosecution would later claim, they did not have a reason to believe that Cameron had done anything to be detained, or that he was even the same person that the caller had been talking about.
He has no warrant. He has no probable cause. No information about any crime other than a traffic offense.
However, Eric would later say that the reason that he and his partner believed that the situation was serious enough for them to cross onto Cameron's property without permission was because they thought they had seen him speeding while driving with children in the car. So, how does someone go from being accused of speeding to being shot to death on their own property? When Eric and Troy went up to Cameron, who was still inside the vehicle, they would later admit that they didn't see any perceived threat. His hands were on the steering wheel of the car, but just seconds later, after believing that Cameron was reaching for a weapon, Eric grabbed his own weapon and started firing at Cameron, killing him. Eric was later charged with manslaughter in connection with Cameron's death. But was it really manslaughter, or was this a case of self-defense, as both Eric and Troy claimed?
Sergeant Schwalm, do you believe that Eric DeValkenir saved your life on December 3rd, 2019? There are tissues behind you.
Yes.
Sergeant Troy Schwalm's face was twisted up, holding back tears. The charge against Eric DeValkenir is involuntary manslaughter, a death as the result of recklessness.
Sergeant Schwalm stands by his claim that Eric saved his life on the day that this incident happened. But prosecutors say this whole thing could have been prevented if these officers had done their job correctly and not chased after an innocent man.
Careful and responsible police officers protect our citizens in their own homes. Careless and irresponsible police officers shoot our citizens in their own homes.
Cameron Lamb was slowly backing into his garage when the 2 officers ran through the yard at him. The prosecution says DeVolcanier fired 4 shots into Lamb's truck, killing him.
If Eric had any hope at all of being acquitted, his defense team would have been able to convince the court that he believed that there was a threat against he and his partner's life. But this was going to be hard to do, considering some pretty incriminating evidence that crime scene investigators discussed in court.
Police said crime scene investigators found Lamb's left arm hanging out the window and a gun on the ground below it. Schwalm testified he did not hear a gun drop to the ground.
So, if there had never been a weapon in Cameron's hand, then why would Eric think that it was necessary to use deadly force at all? Some people even believe that there was not originally a firearm at the scene at all, but that it had been planted there by Eric in hopes of trying to make himself look better. Eric was very emotional as he testified about what he says happened right before he killed Cameron.
He takes his left hand with the gun, and as he brings it along up and around the left-hand side of the steering wheel is when my focus moves from that weapon to the center of his chest.
The prosecutor hit Eric with the tough questions as he tried to get him to explain why he thought it was okay for him to enter Cameron's property with no warrant. But Eric just keeps saying that he acted the way that he was trained and the way that any officer in his position would have done.
No weapon of any kind that were in your mind that you knew about, no information like that at the time. You are now entering private property without a warrant, without probable cause, with your gun drawn. True?
As all officers in my situation would have done.
The prosecutor pointed out how Eric took basically no time at all to think things over before making the decision to fire at Cameron. This was likely to help show the court that there was no reason for Eric to immediately resort to violence. He could have taken many other steps that probably would have prevented this tragedy from happening.
Did you have time to get a warrant?
No, I did not.
Did you have a duty to protect your partner?
Yes, I did.
And do you believe that you ultimately saved his life?
Yes, I do.
Throughout the trial, Eric often became emotional as he talked about what happened, but he continued to stick to what he always claimed, that he had no choice but to kill Cameron because he believed Cameron was going to kill him.
9 seconds from the time you start to encounter this individual without a probable cause, without a warrant, without knowing what crime, before you pull the trigger. 9 seconds.
Before he presents the weapon in a threatening manner, correct?
Yes, 9 seconds.
Yes.
Eventually, it was in the judge's hands to decide whether or not Eric was guilty.
The court is further compelled to find beyond a reasonable doubt that when defendant shot and killed Cameron Lamb, number 1, defendant was not acting in lawful self-defense. Number 2, defendant was not acting in lawful defense of Sergeant Schwalm. And 3, it being conceded that defendant and Sergeant Schwalm were not effecting an arrest of Cameron Lamb or preventing his escape after an arrest.
Ultimately, the judge sided with the prosecution and said that by trespassing on Cameron's property that night without a warrant, he was already committing a crime. Eric then went on to escalate the situation way past where it needed to be. By doing this, he showed that he used poor judgment and was negligent.
As to count 1, in which defendant is charged with the Class C felony of involuntary manslaughter in the first degree, the court finds the defendant guilty of the lesser included offense of involuntary manslaughter in the second degree, a Class E felony. As to count 2, the unclassified felony of armed criminal action, the court finds the defendant guilty.
When the judge announced the verdict and said that Eric had been found guilty, the former cop lowered his head. He looked like he was hopeless and in despair, but in the background, somewhere in the back of the courtroom, what sounded like cheering could be heard. So, after a very long and controversial trial, Eric had been convicted. The only thing that was left was to sentence him for his crimes. Cameron's family and other members of the community asked that the maximum sentence be dished out in order to make sure the victim truly got the justice he deserved.
The Class E felony of involuntary manslaughter in the second degree, I sentence you to a term of incarceration in the Missouri Division of Adult Institutions of 3 years. On the unclassified felony of armed criminal action, I sentence you to a term of incarceration of 6 years in the Missouri Department of Corrections. Those cases, or rather those counts and sentences, will run concurrent with one another for a total term of incarceration of 6 years.
At the end of the day, the court decided that Eric had no reason to go after Cameron, and that if he hadn't pursued him for no reason and made all the bad decisions that he did, Cameron would still probably be alive today.
Cameron Lamb is dead. Eric DeValconaire killed him. And the court has found that that happened because the defendant acted without considering or being aware of the substantial and unjustifiable risks associated with his conduct, and that his actions were a gross deviation from the standard of care that a reasonable person would exercise in the situation.
In total, Eric ended up being sentenced to 3 years in prison for involuntary manslaughter and 6 more for armed criminal conduct. He filed an appeal in hopes of getting his sentence reduced, but in 2023, the court decided that his sentence should be upheld. Cameron's family members were satisfied with the sentence that Eric ended up getting.
It was a fair decision.
He still got a year for every second, them 9 seconds. I don't care if you put them together or not. He got 3 years for one, and he got 6 years for another. So that's a year for each of them seconds that it took him to get so reckless with that gun of his.
Cameron's parents said that they hope that this tragedy will be a learning experience for what not to do if you're a cop and you find yourself in a situation like this. There is no room for being reckless when people's lives are on the line. So, do you think that Eric's sentence fits the crime? Let us know what you think in the comments.
This is a man. John Camfield is a man who is an absolute, total drunk. He doesn't care about anyone but John Camfield. He didn't care about those children he ran over. He didn't care about that pregnant woman whose vehicle he ran into.
Throughout his career as a law enforcement officer, John Camfield of Mississippi had seen plenty of people make the mistake of getting behind the wheel of a vehicle after drinking. This was because he specialized in DUI enforcement. John knew well, probably better than most anyone else, how lives can be destroyed in just a second due to drinking and driving. But in 2017, it was John who decided to get behind the wheel of a car after drinking, and his mistake ended up hurting many different people.
New tonight, a former cop is going to prison for a deadly drunken driving crash, mowing down several kids walking home from their bus stop. One of those students died last year.
John ended up mowing down a group of children who were walking home from school after getting off the bus. He hit 5 kids in total, and one of them, 13-year-old Jaheim Robertson, did not survive. After crashing into the kids, John did what can only be described as the most cowardly thing anyone could possibly do in that situation. He ran away, leaving the students bloodied and battered in the road. He did nothing to try and help them. He just kept driving and then ended up crashing and hitting someone for a second time. This time it was a car being driven by a pregnant woman. She was injured in the crash, but luckily survived her injuries.
How is the pregnant woman?
She's good. She was treated, she was transported and treated, but she's doing all right.
Meanwhile, an 11-year-old daughter of another officer that lived nearby had seen John hit the 5 kids during the last crash and speed off. She had been on the school bus that those kids had just gotten off of, so as soon as she could, she ran to find her father and tell him what happened. After the little girl's father, JJ Quintana, heard about the accident, he took off running out of his house without even taking the time to put any shoes on. He did what he could to help the injured children until the paramedics arrived. Not long after, he received word about the second car crash that John had caused. He jumped into his patrol car and rushed to the scene.
Jonathan Quintana remembers Camfield stumbling and had this to say about plowing down a group of school children.
He advised your daughter.
After making sure that the pregnant woman was getting the medical treatment she needed, JJ was able to take John into custody under suspicion of drunk driving. John knew he was in major trouble, so he refused to do a blood alcohol test, but law enforcement got a warrant for the test, which allowed them to test him for alcohol anyway. Sure enough, they discovered that John's blood alcohol level was 0.147, which is almost double the legal limit. He would later be charged with DUI manslaughter and other related charges. Sheriff Grady Judd said people knew that John had an alcohol problem and that they had tried to help get him sober over and over again.
The sheriff told us he was a very competent law enforcement officer, when he was sober.
But according to Sheriff Judd, John Camfield cared more about alcohol than he did being a good cop and helping other people. The sheriff also said that as long as John remained a free man, the community would be in danger.
He said, we tried and tried and tried to help him, but he was more interested in himself and his drinking and his alcohol than he was in his job, his employers, these children. This is a classic case. You're looking at the guy that needs to be in prison for the rest of his life, because if he's not in prison, the community around him is not safe.
The only right outcome of this horrific tragedy would be for John to receive the longest prison sentence possible.
And we're going to do everything we can to accommodate him with a very long prison sentence. He's worked for 10 different agencies. They shuffled him around. And certainly when y'all dig into the aftermath of talking to all of them, you can probably get a better history.
Sheriff Judd made it clear that John Camfield's life as he knew it was over. He wouldn't be celebrating his wedding in a couple months as he had planned. He would not be free to do so.
We just made a couple of quick phone calls this morning and found out this much.
It appears on his Facebook page that he was getting married?
In August, he told them he was getting married.
He was getting married in August.
If I was his fiance, I would scratch that date. He won't be available.
After the dust had settled and the charges had been filed, John got himself a lawyer. He later claimed that things were not as they seemed. He said that the crash that killed Jaheim Robertson and injured others was not caused by alcohol at all, but by a health problem he had been struggling with. He also said that he didn't remember anything from that day at all.
I had no way of controlling the events that occurred on April 27th. I had not been drinking at all that day.
Clearly, many people in the community, including his victims' family members, found this hard to believe. After all, the results of his blood test had shown how much alcohol was in John's blood at the time of the crash. Even if he had some sort of health problem too, that still wouldn't excuse the fact that he drank and drove and then fled the scene after causing the accident.
Camfield fled the scene but was caught down the road after crashing into another driver. The other students recovered from their injuries, but families say will never truly recover.
I, as a parent, cannot erase the vision that he had to endure that day.
Camfield apologizing to the family, but blaming health issues for the crash, not alcohol.
He pled no contest to the charges against him, which basically meant that he neither admitted or denied what he had been accused of. So, as far as the potential sentence he could face, this plea was the same as if he had pleaded guilty. The minimum amount of time in jail he could expect to face was 16 years, but many people believed that he deserved to serve much more time than that. While the victims believed that John's claim about having medical issues was nothing more than an excuse for the horrible things that he did, at the end of the day, it was going to be up to a judge to believe it. It would also be up to a judge to decide to be lenient with John and give him the minimum sentence, or send a message to all drunk drivers out there by hitting John with major prison time.
This was not intentional. This was not a drinking and driving issue. This was a medical issue.
In the end, the judge not buying it, sentencing him to 35 years behind bars. The family relieved to finally get some justice, although it will never ease their heartache.
Yep, you heard that right. The judge decided to sentence John to 35 years in prison. Considering he was 49 years old at the time of the crash, this was almost the same as giving John a life sentence. It doesn't seem likely that this former cop will ever see life outside of prison walls again. While at court for John's sentencing, the family members of the victims, including young Jaheim Robertson's parents, were given a chance to tell the judge about how John's selfish decision to drive drunk changed their lives forever.
Late's Melissa Marino was in court today when the judge handed down that 35-year sentence.
An emotional day in the courtroom as the victim's family shared their story of heartbreak.
He mowed them down like he was at the bowling alley.
Can you imagine having to face the man who ran over your child and then ran away?
Family of 13-year-old Jaheim Robertson fighting back tears, speaking to the man responsible for his death, a former DUI enforcement officer from Mississippi.
You took that away from me. You took that away from my family. You took that away from his sisters.
Investigators say John Camfield was twice the legal limit when he veered off the road, hitting 5 Dundee Ridge Middle Academy students near their bus stop 2 years ago.
Jaheim's mother was emotional. The pain was clear in her voice as she talked about how John stole a future with Jaheim from everyone who had loved him.
You don't know the pain that you have caused our family.
13-year-old Jaheim Robertson's parents in tears, breaking their silence in court.
My son was mowed down and killed by John Camfield, an ex-cop who chose to drink your sorrows away and then get behind the wheel.
After the 35-year sentence was handed down, reporters asked Jaheim's family if they were satisfied with the sentence. They said that they were relieved that the judge saw it fit to give John the maximum punishment instead of just hitting him with a slap on the wrist.
The judge saw it for what it was, and they shot the sentence that he truly deserved.
But at the end of the day, there is no sentence, no matter how severe, that could ever bring back the young life that was lost so tragically.
Can I bring him back? What all I'm asking is for justice for him.
This last case, which took place in May of 2018 in Miami, Florida, proves that just because you're a cop doesn't mean you can get away with literally shoving people around to get what you want when you want it. 51-year-old cop Lester Bonablust, who had been with this particular law enforcement force for over 2 decades, thought that he could use his position of power to get special treatment. When that didn't work, he ended up picking a fight in one of the last places you should ever start a problem at all. In a hospital. Lester started screaming at and then attacked someone who was just trying to do their job, a 66-year-old registered nurse.
Now at 5:30, it was sentencing day for a police officer who was convicted of attacking a male nurse at Jackson Memorial Hospital. That attack happened back in May of last year. That officer was fired for that incident. He had been with the Miami police force for more than 20 years.
And now he has to pay the price for slamming the nurse to the ground.
As most people who have ever had to deal with having a sick loved one know, it can be stressful, and the hospital can be an overwhelming place, especially if you're really worried about how your family member is doing and want to make sure they are getting the best care possible they can. But the bottom line is that you still have to trust the doctors and nurses to do their job, because this is what they're trained for. You can't try to force them to give you or your family member special treatment, no matter who you are. That's what Lester Bonablust did, and he not only lost his job because of it, but ended up getting in some major legal trouble too.
And that officer will serve some time behind bars. The incident happened right here at Jackson Memorial Hospital. Investigators say when nurses refused to readmit that ex-officer's niece, he grabbed one of them and threw them to the ground.
Lester admitted to what he did and was convicted of assault. While he did get some jail time, it was only a month and a half.
Count 1, battery on a person 65 years of age or older, and guilty on 1 count of false imprisonment.
A Miami-Dade County judge sentencing former City of Miami police officer 51-year-old Lester Bonablust to 45 days behind bars, 3 years probation, and 100 hours of community service.
Lester's family members cried when they heard that he would have to spend time behind bars.
Family members of Bonablust in tears following the sentencing after the former Miami cop was convicted of attacking 66-year-old James Nicholson, a registered nurse at Jackson Memorial Hospital in May of last year.
For the victim, registered nurse James Nicholson, the punishment that Lester got is not enough, considering what he made him go through.
I was never ever expected to be grabbed from the back and thrown from side to side, to a point where I was yelling at the top of my lungs, help, help.
The whole incident began when Lester's niece spent some time in the hospital for mental health treatment. She was later discharged, but her father brought her back the next day in hopes of getting her more treatment. But the medical staff at the hospital told the girl's father that she did not meet the qualifications to be readmitted. The father called Lester and told him about what was going on with his niece. Lester arrived soon after and made it clear that he was not happy.
The girl's father called Bonablust, who arrived at the hospital in uniform, demanded she be admitted when Nicholson said he
couldn't discuss the patient's business, Vonenblush grabbed the nurse by his jacket and slammed him to the ground.
All James Nicholson had been trying to do was follow the rules and do his job. He couldn't break hospital protocol by giving Lester the details of his niece's medical information. It didn't matter who he was. While in court, Lester apologized and owned up to what he did.
Just would like to say that I'm remorseful for the incident that took place.
The former cop taking full responsibility for his actions in court for an incident Nicholson says should have never happened.
But John Nicholson wants to make it clear that no healthcare worker deserved to go through what he went through at the hands of a cop. Healthcare workers already have tough enough jobs as it is without having to worry about being slammed to the ground by cops who don't know how to control their anger.
What happened to me that day should not happen to anybody, especially a healthcare worker.
A lawyer representing James Nicholson told the press that there were plans to file a civil lawsuit against the county to make sure that something like this never happens to another person again. Do you think that a month and a half in jail plus probation and community service is really severe enough of a sentence for him, considering he assaulted a healthcare worker? If he had not been a cop and had been just anyone else in the hospital that day when he assaulted John, would he have received the same treatment? Let us know what you think in the comments. Thanks for watching, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more.